Hey again. In this screencast, it's going to be hopefully a little bit shorter. I'm going to talk about the display property, and specifically, I'm going to talk about how to create menus using the display property and lists. So first of all, the CSS display property is used to basically tell an element how to render. So we already know that all tags are either block level or inline. Block level elements, of course, take up the full width of its container, of its parent element, and automatically start on a new line. Content that comes after it also starts on a new line, whereas inline elements only take up the space that is needed for the content to display. So for example, on the page I have open right now, we have, zoom in a little here, I have an H1, an H2, and then a couple lists. H1s and H2s, of course, are block level elements, and we can see when I hover over using the inspector, it takes up the full width of the parent. The parent is the body tag, so that's going to be the whole browser window. And content that comes after it automatically starts on a new line. The display property can effectively override that behavior, or in other words, it can convert a block level element to an inline element, or vice versa. So for example, I'm going to just do this using the inspector here. Keep in mind the inspector, when I make changes, nothing is saved. This is just meant for troubleshooting and to see what things look like for design purposes. So on this H1, I'm going to modify the display property. You can see there's a lot of options in here. I'm only going to cover a couple today. And in fact, we're not even going to go through all of them this semester. But what I'm going to do, so by default, again, an H1 is a block level element. So it's going to display as a block. I'm going to use the display property to tell it to render as an inline element. So we didn't really see much of a change there. You can see it moved up, and that's because block level elements have margins by default, while inline elements do not. So that's the only thing we see so far, but if I go and do the same thing to the H2 after it, display is an inline element, you can see that these are now displaying as inline elements. They are only taking up the space that is needed for the content that it contains. So nothing goes to a new line. It's not taking up the full width. They're displaying and basically overriding or converting those block level elements into inline elements. So in this case, it's not exactly helpful. Usually you want headers to be, to take up the full width and to be on their own line. So I'm going to refresh to go back to where I started. Where this comes in really handy is for creating menus. Now most web developers, or rather a best practice for creating menus on your website is to code them as lists, either ordered or unordered. It doesn't really matter. So for example, let's go look at this site over here, umich.edu. At the top, we've got a couple different menus. This dark blue bar up at the top, and then this one here, and then I think at the bottom there's probably several menus on the site. If we look at the code for each of them, you can see that first menu, or that navigation bar at the top, is coded as an unordered list. So each menu item is a list item. So again, this is standard practice done for accessibility and usability reasons. You don't have to do this, but it's best practice to create all of your menus, all of your navigational elements as lists. Of course, when we do that, without any CSS, this is what our menu would look like, which in some cases is fine, but not when you want to actually make your website look a little more interesting, like what we're looking at here. So to take our list and convert it into something that could look like this, for example, we're going to use the display property. There's actually two methods. I'm going to show you the first one today, which uses the display property, and the second method uses floats, which I'm going to go into in the next screencast. Okay, so here is my HTML over here. I have my two lists. I'm just going to modify the second one to be a horizontal menu. So what I'm going to do to distinguish between these two lists, I'm going to add a class to the one that I want to look different. So I'm going to call it menu. So I've added a class using the class attribute to this unordered list, and I've named this class menu. Keep in mind, the names of your classes, the names of your IDs, they are completely arbitrary. It's up to you. You just need to be consistent, and you need to only use letters, numbers, underscores, and hyphens. Okay, so I've added a class to it, so now I can go up here in my CSS and target only that specific list. So I'm going to say find the class, that's what the dot means, named menu. And for the list items, so I'm targeting this UL, and specifically I'm targeting the list items in that menu. So for the list items inside, I can get even more specific here. Find the unordered list that has a class called menu, target the list items within that, and make those list items, which by default are going to display as block level elements all the way across the page, online, make them display as inline elements. So with just that one little line of code, that one CSS property, I've now converted my list, which is a block level element, I've now converted it to a series of inline elements, so it's essentially a horizontal menu, a single line horizontal menu. Of course, this doesn't look that great. To make it a little more interesting, this is where the box model comes into play. So I am going to go ahead and, in addition to telling those list items to display inline, I'm going to give them some background colors. Let's see what that looks like. It's pretty good. Of course, the background color I chose is darker, so I'm going to have to modify my text color. Before I do that, though, I'm also going to add a little padding. So this is getting a little more, looking a little bit more like an actual menu. To target the text color, I actually have to get even more specific than the list item. I have to target my link, my anchor tag. And this is because you can see sort of here that the browser, or you can see up here, the browser by default gives links this blue color text. So in order to override that, to make it white, I need to target the link, the anchor, not just the thing above it, which is the list item. And now I have a horizontal menu. I might do one more thing here, which is to get rid of those underlines. Oops, I'm going to say text decoration none. And I could, if I wanted to go even further, I could add a hover effect to the link. Remember those pseudo classes? I could say a:hover text decoration underline to make it come back when you hover over it. But for now, this I basically converted this unordered list into what looks to be a real menu. The last thing you would want to do with this, potentially, is unordered list, the parent tag here for your list items, the UL itself, by default has a left padding. You can see it's indented. That's just the natural behavior of list, to indent within a section. So if you want, you could target that UL, and I just did padding left here. You could do all four sides if you want, but the The main thing I'm worried about here is the left padding. You can just set that to 0, and now it's all the way over on the left. So that's basically it. The last thing I want to mention is the other thing that you would use display for. So the primary thing is to convert a block level element to an inline element, or vice versa. We also can use display to essentially hide an element. So I can say display none. Now my H1 it's still in the code, but it's basically disappeared from the display, from what the user sees. So the reason you would do that, the most common example would be a drop-down menu. Drop-down menus, the actual sub-menu is in the code, but so it's by default set to not display until the user hovers over the trigger. Once they hover over the trigger, then you say display block or inline or whatever you want to display it as. There are a couple other display values that we're going to go into, not till like the last 2 weeks, and those are display flex and display grid. Those are more advanced layout tools that we'll talk about after we talk about floats and positioning. So that's it. That's how to create a horizontal menu out of an unordered or an ordered list using the display property. As I said, this is one way to do this. The second way is using floats, which I will go into in the screencast where I talk about floats. So that's it. Let me know if you have any questions.